Welcome back to Storytime Boulevard, your destination to sleep. I'm Andrew, and I'm your host. Tonight we invite you to settle in for another relaxing journey. Our story is called The Teacup Traveler, a tale of hidden tea shops, dream realms, and the simple magic of following the tug in your heart. But before we begin, let's take a moment to slow everything down. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Take a long, slow breath in through your nose, hold it gently, and exhale through your mouth like you're letting go of the day. Again, breathe in and out. Feel the weight of the day melt from your shoulders. Let your jaws soften, your hands relax, and your thoughts drift like leaves on a quiet stream. You are here now, safe, still, and ready to dream. In the town of Willowmere, a quiet, timeless place where the sky always seemed to blush before sunset, and the trees leaned in like they were listening to secrets carried on the wind. There lived a woman named Ella. Ella wasn't famous. She didn't seek out attention, nor did she shy away from it. She simply existed gently, like the last page of a favorite book, or the soft hum of a lullaby you hadn't heard in years. She lived alone in a cozy apartment above a winding old bookstore with creaky floorboards and mismatched windows. The whole building smelled of paper, dust, and cinnamon bark, a scent that clung to her clothes like an old friend. Her mornings were slow and ritualistic. Steaming tea, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, and the occasional sound of wind chimes stirring when no breeze passed by. She spent her days shelving dog-eared novels, slipping handwritten poems between the pages of her favorites for curious readers to find, and sketching dreams into the margins of half-used notebooks. She often brewed tea with herbs from unlabeled jars, mixtures that tasted of earth, honey, and something just a little enchanted, though she could never remember exactly what she'd added. But despite her contentment, there was a quiet ache inside her, a longing, not loud or dramatic, but constant, like a forgotten melody humming just beneath her skin. It was a sense of waiting, not for a person or a moment, but for something unnamed, as though part of her belonged to a story she hadn't reached yet. And then, one chilly afternoon, the kind that draped everything in a soft grey hush, the world shifted. Mist clung to the glass of her window panes, blurring the view of the sleepy street below. The town moved in slow motion. Distant bells, the occasional flutter of a bird's wings, the rustle of leaves like whispers in the wind. That's when she felt it. Not a voice, exactly. More like a gentle tug from inside her chest. A quiet nudge that said, "Now." Without thinking, Ella rose. She slipped into her coziest scarf, the one with a little hole near the edge that she always meant to stitch, and pulled on her favourite boots, worn soft from years of wandering. Though there wasn't a drop of rain, she took her umbrella anyway. An old habit, as if preparing for the unexpected might somehow invite it. She stepped out into the cobblestone street, and immediately everything felt off. Not in a frightening way, but like the air had shifted just slightly, like a breath had been held. And that's when she saw it. A narrow alleyway between the tailor's shop and the candle maker's. A slim, winding gap where there had never been one before. It shimmered faintly, not with light, but with possibility, like the way heat dances above pavement on summer days. Though the air was crisp and still, Ella paused. Logic told her to ignore it, to turn back, but curiosity whispered louder. And somewhere deep inside, that quiet ache began to flutter, like wings unfolding, drawn in by wonder and something older, older than time, older than memory. She stepped between the buildings and followed the alley's gentle curve, her boots making the softest sound against stone. The path twisted once, then twice, and suddenly widened. There, nestled between ivy-covered walls and crooked lantern poles, stood a little teashop that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Its roof slanted like a shrug. Its windows blinked with golden light. Lanterns dangled from the eaves like sleepy fireflies. And above the door hung a hand-carved wooden sign with a name etched in curling script: The Clockwork Cup. The moment she stepped inside, the world exhaled. Warmth wrapped around her like a well-worn quilt. The golden light seemed to hum. Soft music floated on the air, not from speakers or instruments, but from somewhere deeper, like the building itself had a lullaby to share. Shelves spiraled around the room like a carousel of colour, each one crowded with teacups, porcelain, ceramic, glass and clay. Some were mismatched and chipped. Others sparkled like stars in a midnight sky. But all of them buzzed softly, as if murmuring to one another, or perhaps to her. Behind the counter stood a tall, graceful woman with skin like sun-warmed stone and silver hair braided into delicate vines. Her robe shimmered like ink under moonlight, and around her neck hung a necklace made of tiny orbs, each glowing faintly like captured suns. "Welcome, Ella," she said, her voice a velvet murmur that wrapped around the syllables like silk. Ella startled. How do you know my... The woman smiled, not unkindly. I know everyone who finds their way here, she replied. The ones who are meant to travel usually do. She turned, reaching up to a high shelf, and carefully retrieved a single teacup. It was deep indigo, rimmed with etched constellations that shimmered when they caught the light. If you looked closely, tiny shooting stars darted across the glaze like a sky frozen in motion. This one, the woman said, belongs to you. She placed it in Ella's hands with a reverence that made her breath hitch. Drink it slowly, she whispered, and remember, not all travel happens on maps. Ella stared into the cup. The tea swirled gently, though she hadn't stirred it. It shimmered faintly, reflecting not her face, but clouds, stars, and places she'd never seen. She brought it to her lips. The first sip tasted like midnight and snowfall, like forgotten laughter, like the stories she used to write and tuck away in drawers. The warmth spread through her chest, slow and golden, like memory, like home. And then the world began to tilt, gently, not like falling, more like unfolding. The teashop walls stretched into starlight. The scent of cinnamon and old books faded into sea air and lilac. Her breath caught. Her heart stilled. The light pulsed around her like a heartbeat. And when Ella opened her eyes, she was no longer in Willowmere. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere stitched from dreams and possibility. And her journey was only just beginning. When Ella opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the sky. It was vast and painted in hues no artist could name. Warm gold melting into petal pink, fading into a soft, powdery lavender. 3 moons hung low like gentle watchers, each a different size and shade. One silver, one rose gold, and one the pale blue of a robin's egg. They moved slowly across the sky, like dancers, in no hurry at all. She was standing barefoot in a wide, open field, but not an ordinary field. The ground was covered in feathergrass, tall, silky, soft blades that brushed against her legs like curious whispers. Each strand shimmered slightly in the light, casting a soft, iridescent glow that pulsed gently, like breathing. When the wind stirred, the entire field rippled in waves, as though it were exhaling, and the sound, oh, the sound. It wasn't silence, but it wasn't noise either. The feathergrass made a quiet, rustling song that was somewhere between a lullaby and a memory. It wrapped around her gently, urging her forward. Above her, cloudbirds drifted lazily through the sky, their wings trailing sparkles like shooting stars. They cooed softly, singing notes that shimmered in the air like translucent bubbles. Some of the bubbles floated down to the field, and when they popped against the grass, the ground beneath glowed for just a moment, as if the earth remembered the song. Ella looked down and realized something strange. There were no shadows here. The light didn't come from the sky alone. It seemed to rise from within the land itself, as though the very air was filled with illumination. And she began walking through the field. The feather grass parted just slightly for her, clearing a soft path. She passed trees shaped like upside-down chandeliers, dripping with glowing moss, and hanging bells that chimed only when you weren't listening directly. Suddenly, something flickered at the edge of her vision. She turned to see a fox. Not just any fox, but a lean, clever-looking creature with snow-white fur, a satchel across its back, and a tiny monocle perched perfectly on its snout. The fox stood upright and adjusted his bag. "Ah, you're here. Excellent." Ella blinked. I am?" "Indeed," he replied, with a brisk nod. "You're the dreamer from the Indigo Cup, aren't you? It's been a while since we had one of those." Before she could answer, the fox turned and began trotting away through the grass. "Come along now," he called over his shoulder. "The moonlight picnic is about to begin, and you'll need your invitation." "My what?" But he was already disappearing through a curtain of vines that shimmered like crystal strands. Ella had no choice but to follow. On the other side of the vines was a clearing like none she'd ever seen. Mossy cushions and floating picnic blankets hovered just inches above the ground, swaying softly like hammocks on invisible breezes. Lanterns, shaped like dandelions, bobbed in mid-air, each one glowing with a different emotion: joy, peace, curiosity, even a flicker of boldness. Around the blankets were creatures of all kinds. A bear in suspenders, writing poetry into a leather journal. A trio of owls playing chess with pieces made of clouds. A group of butterflies sharing stories through wing patterns that pulsed like Morse code. The fox bowed low and presented Ella with a teacup. Not her indigo one, but a new cup, translucent and made of what looked like moonlight solidified. She took it carefully, and as she sipped, her senses expanded. She could hear the stars humming. She could see music dancing in the air. She could feel the soil beneath her feet, whispering secrets in a language she didn't know, but somehow understood. And just for a moment, just a beautiful, aching breath of a moment, the ache she'd always carried was gone. Ella laughed, not because something was funny, but because it felt like her chest had finally opened and the wind had rushed in, filling spaces she didn't know were empty. As the moons rose higher and the skies darkened to a dreamy indigo, the guests at the moonlight picnic began to drift away, dissolving gently into constellations, or curling up beneath the grass to dream again. The fox walked her back through the feather grass, quiet now. At the edge of the field, he paused. "This realm remembers those who wander," he said softly, his monocle catching the light. "You may forget some of the details when you wake. That's how it works, but the feeling will stay with you, always." Ella looked back at the field, aglow with its gentle light and soft lullaby of wind and wing. Then she closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was somewhere new, another world, another chapter, and the journey was far from over. When Ella stepped through the shimmer at the edge of the feathergrass field, the world around her gently transformed again. Gone was the soft earth beneath her feet. Now she stood at the edge of a cliff made of cloudstone, smooth, glowing, and cool to the touch, gazing out into a sky that felt impossibly vast. Before her floated a sea of islands suspended in the sky, each one drifting slowly, as if bobbing on invisible waves. They weren't anchored by anything, not ropes, not roots, not reason, and yet they moved with grace and purpose, circling one another in a celestial waltz. The air here was weightless, crisp, with the faint scent of jasmine and sugar dust. Wind carried sparkling particles that twinkled like bits of thought mid-formation. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes sang in a harmony that made her chest swell with emotion she couldn't name. A voice beside her broke the stillness. "You're just in time," said a figure draped in robes made of fog and embroidered starlight. Ella turned to see a tall being, not quite human, not quite anything else, with eyes like slow turning galaxies. They held out their hand, and a small gondola appeared behind them. It was crafted from glass and lace, its edges glowing with quiet magic. Soft velvet cushions lined the inside, and no oars were in sight. Ella hesitated. "Where does it go?" The figure smiled gently. "Where your dreaming dares to take you." So she stepped in. The gondola glided forward effortlessly, carried not by water, but by thought. Below her, the clouds swirled like whipped cream, and above, the sky swam with constellations that rearranged themselves into shapes she half remembered from childhood dreams. A fox chasing a star, a door blooming like a flower, a clock melting into an open book. As they drifted among the floating isles of reverie, Ella began to see the islands up close. Each one was a dream made real. One was a library with no walls, just endless shelves spiraling upward, guarded by translucent jellyfish who floated silently between the pages, lighting the titles with a bioluminescent glow. Another was a forest where gravity reversed every hour. The trees grew down from the sky, and flowers unfolded beneath her feet like whispered secrets. There, children with wings of parchment played hopscotch across floating stones that hummed like tuning forks. Still another was a mirror isle, where the surface reflected not just your face, but your potential, shimmering images of who you could become if you dared to follow your truest longing. But the third island they approached was quieter. Still, this one was woven from clouds and dreams deferred, and on it stood a single weeping willow, whose branches held lanterns made from old wishes, some faded, some flickering brightly. This was where the gondola chose to land. Ella stepped onto the soft surface. It felt like walking on warm wool, and made her way to the base of the tree. There, waiting patiently beneath its canopy, sat a woman with wings made of folded paper. Her eyes were kind. Her smile was knowing. "You've brought your dream feather," she said softly. Ella's brow furrowed. "My dream feather?" The woman gently placed a hand over Ella's heart, and a soft golden thread pulled free from her chest, glowing, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that matched her breath. "This," said the paper-winged woman, "is the shape of your longing." With careful, reverent hands, she folded it into an origami boat. Slow, deliberate creases made with ritual precision. Then she placed it into a nearby pool of silvery water that reflected stars even in daylight. As the boat touched the surface, it floated outward, leaving a trail of stardust behind. The moment it drifted out of sight, the sky overhead rippled. Constellations rearranged themselves once again, this time forming a map, not of land, but of possibility. Ella felt something shift deep inside her. Not a thunderclap, not a jolt. Something quieter, like a door opening in a room she didn't know existed. The woman with paper wings leaned in and whispered, "You don't have to know the way forward. You only need to be willing to walk it." Then she gently pressed a small charm into Ella's palm, a miniature version of the origami boat, and said, "Keep this close. It will remember even when you forget." Back in the gondola, as it lifted from the dreamlike isle, Ella looked back once more. The willow's lanterns swayed gently, and for a moment she swore one of them flickered in a color she had never seen before, something that felt like hope. Above her, stars continued to dance, and far ahead, a swirling aurora stretched across the sky, beckoning her toward the next realm. And she was ready. As the gondola drifted through the final veil of dreamlight, the skies above Ella began to deepen. soft indigo, giving way to a velvet twilight laced with flickering constellations. Stars blinked like fireflies, and the air turned cooler, more still. A hush fell over everything. Not silence exactly, but a sacred quiet, like the world was holding its breath. This was a place that felt older than any dream. Ella stepped out of the gondola and onto a path made of smooth, glowing stones. Each step gave off a soft pulse of light, responding gently to her presence. She found herself at the edge of a forest, but not one filled with ordinary trees. These trees were impossibly tall, with trunks of deep violet and leaves like spun glass, shimmering faintly in the dim light. The branches curved in elegant arches, reaching toward each other like fingers longing to intertwine. The entire forest glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, like moonlight caught in water. But what truly set this grove apart were the bottles. They grew from the trees like fruit, hundreds, thousands of them, delicate, dangling glass vessels that swayed gently in the breeze. Inside each one flickered a soft light, like a captured firefly. Some glowed warm and golden. Others were dim, flickering softly. A few were nearly dark, but still they pulsed, like forgotten songs waiting to be remembered. Ella stepped beneath one of the trees, mesmerized. The bottles chimed gently as the wind stirred, producing a quiet, haunting melody that seemed to awaken something deep inside her. The feeling of being rocked as a child, or hearing your name said with love in a voice long gone. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing a small round bottle with a deep amber glow. It released from the branch with a soft pop, no louder than a sigh, and floated down into her hands. As she uncorked it, the memory inside bloomed around her like mist. Suddenly, she was 6 years old, standing in her grandmother's kitchen, flour smudged on her cheeks, the radio playing an old jazz tune. Her grandmother was laughing, spinning her in circles as they danced across the checkered floor. The smell of vanilla and oranges filled the air. For a moment, Ella was there again. The warmth, the rhythm, the love. Then the mist faded, and she was back beneath the tree, tears on her cheeks, not from sadness, but from remembering something that still lived inside her. She moved slowly through the grove, collecting memories. A glowing green bottle showed her as a teenager, lying in the grass, sketching stars in a notebook while a thunderstorm rolled in. A pink one flickered with the joy of her first kiss, awkward, exhilarating, lit by the golden glow of streetlights. A tiny silver bottle held a quiet moment from just last year, sitting in her bookstore, watching the snow fall outside with a cup of tea in her hand, feeling still, peaceful. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, her hand reached for a bottle nestled high in the crook of a tree's limb. This one glowing deep blue, with a shimmer like starlight caught in rain. The moment she opened it, she gasped. This memory hadn't happened yet. She stood in a cozy home surrounded by people she didn't recognize, not yet anyway. A fireplace glowed, laughter filled the air, and music played softly in the background. She saw her own face, older but radiant, eyes bright with fulfillment and ease. There were shelves lined with books she'd written, paintings of far-off places she'd visited, a life full of stories, love, magic, a life lived. It was a glimpse, not of the past, but of what could be, and it was breathtaking. The bottle sealed itself gently and floated back into the branches. She didn't need to hold on to it. It would wait for her. At the heart of the grove stood one final tree, older, grander than the rest. Its bark shimmered like moonstone, and its roots pulsed with quiet light. As Ella approached, the trees around her began to chime softly, all their melodies folding together into one glowing harmony, a lullaby made from her own memories. The tree opened gently at its center, revealing a hollow core. Inside sat a single item, her teacup. The indigo porcelain shimmered gently, the etched constellations now glowing brighter than ever. As she picked it up, she noticed something new had appeared along the rim. A single word, written in the same golden script as her name. Remember. She held it close. The grove began to dissolve, not with sadness, but like a dream gently coming to an end. The bottles folded into the trees. The light faded into dusk, and Ella closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she was back in her bed. The room quiet, the air still, but the teacup sat warm on her nightstand, and the feeling in her chest, that sense of home, of self, of wholeness, lingered like the soft glow of dawn. Some journeys never leave you. Some dreams are realer than we know. Ella awoke slowly, as though rising from deep water, not with a start, but with a softness, a gentle floating back to her body, to her room, to the world that waited beyond the dream. The first thing she noticed was the stillness, the kind that only happens in the earliest hours of morning, when the sky is still holding its breath, and the world hasn't quite remembered how to be loud yet. She blinked against the quiet grey light filtering through her curtains, and turned her head toward the nightstand, and there it was. The teacup, indigo, warm and glowing, ever so faintly, just enough to cast the softest light across her bedsheets. The constellations along the rim shimmered like they had in the shop, and as she reached out to hold it, the golden word etched into the ceramic caught her eye once again. Remember. She stared at it for a long time, not because she was trying to recall the details, the dream worlds, the talking fox, the field of feathergrass, the floating isles, the memory grove. She remembered all of that clearly. She stared because something inside her had changed. It wasn't just the places she had visited or the beings she had met. It was that somewhere along the journey, she had remembered herself. The version of her that still believed in wonder. The version that wasn't afraid to follow the tug in her chest. The version that had longed for more, without always knowing what more meant. And now, she didn't need to define it. She just needed to trust it. She rose from bed and padded softly into the kitchen, the teacup still cradled in her hands like a secret. The morning light was gold now, slipping through the window like a blessing. As the kettle whistled and the steam curled into the air, she found herself humming, a melody she'd heard in the grove, maybe, or from a lantern, or maybe it was just hers all along. She didn't rush the morning. She let it unfold slowly, steeping her tea with quiet reverence, placing the cup back on the nightstand and opening her notebook with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from readiness. Words came, not forced, not perfect, but true. She wrote about the fox and the boat and the glowing bottles. She wrote about laughter she hadn't felt in years. She wrote about the ache, the one that had once curled up in her chest like an unanswered question, and how it now felt like a compass, because maybe the ache had never been a hole to fill. Maybe it was a door, and she had finally walked through it. That night, Ella left her window cracked open. She lit a single candle and placed the indigo teacup beside it, as though welcoming something back, a breeze, a dream, a spark. And as she climbed into bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin, she smiled. Not because everything made sense, but because she no longer needed it to. She knew there would be more journeys, more realms, more whispers from the world behind the world. And when they called, she would listen, because the clockwork cup is always there for those who dare to remember. And some adventures are just a sip away. The end. Good night, dear dreamer. From all of us here at Storytime Boulevard, may your rest be peaceful, your dreams full of wonder, and your heart forever open to the quiet magic that lingers in the spaces between. You're never too old to imagine, never too far to return.